recognizing your borders. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Dr. Becky Mancuso from BGSU History Department, and it's my pleasure to be your host for the evening and to get the program started. And I would like to begin the program with our land acknowledgement statement. The region in which Bowling Green State University and its campuses are situated on inhabit the Great Black Swamp and the Lower Great Lakes region. The land is the homeland of the Wyandot, Kickapoo, Miami, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, and multiple other indigenous tribal nations, past and present, who were forcibly removed to and from the area. We recognize these historical and contemporary ties in our efforts toward decolonizing history, and we thank the indigenous individuals and communities who have been living and working on this land from time immemorial. The BGSU Reddin Symposium, which have focused on the Canada-US relationship, have been hosted by our institution since the 1980s, thanks to the generosity of the Reddin family of Bowling Green. And we have Municipal Judge Mark Reddin here tonight, and his wife representing the family. Would you give a wave and be recognized? Thank you. And I'd also like to take a moment to thank Becky Brown, a wonderful coordinator who did the lion's share of the work to get this all together. We have an outstanding group of speakers this evening, but before we get into the program, let me make a couple of remarks. You'll see from your program we're having a short refreshment break at 6:45, just in a room across the hall there, the meeting room. And we'll reconvene at 7:10 for our third speaker and the Q&A session. We've made one small change to the program. Just when we reconvene, we'll have a bonus speaker, Dr. Leopard Chalou, who will take 5 minutes to tell us about eclipses in Mexico, as we did not want to leave out that third country in North America. We're here tonight because eclipses simply will not respect our borders. The eclipse, as it follows its path across North America, reminds us of how we have been and are connected. The Reddin Symposium programs have always emphasized the importance of looking across borders, looking at so many shared interests and shared problems in North America. As one scholar wisely said, with many of the problems we face, it's silly to say, oh, Canada, there's a hole in your side of the boat, or oh, the hole is in the US side of the boat. We are, of course, all in the same boat, and we have these shared problems that we should recognize. And these problems certainly affect our region. So holding this event is one way we can highlight the importance of Canada to the US and to our region. And we're coming together, everyone, as we to celebrate this unusual event. The person to explain Canada's importance to our region is our distinguished guest, Mr. Colin Bird, Consul General of Canada in Detroit. We're honored to host Mr. Bird tonight, and I'd like to invite him to the podium. Mr. Bird, you're welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Rebecca, and thank you for the work that Bowling Green University does to keep the Canada-US relationship going strong. The work that you do, the work that the Reddin family has done to sort of keep Bowling Green at the forefront, I think, of academic conversations between Canada and the United States are a real tribute to this community. So thank you for that, for your parents as well. It's an honor to be here. It's great to see such a great crowd coming out for this event. You know, most academics and diplomats don't like to be plunged into darkness, but I think we are all looking forward to doing that this April. And while we're doing it, the wisdom that we're going to hear tonight is going to give us that added extra understanding of what we're experiencing and what we're seeing as we look heavenward. And we really are at a golden age of collaboration in space between Canada and the United States. And you know, recent headlines, recent news about space, there are troubling elements, and ever more so now, We do need to be focusing on peaceful cooperation in space. And what you see with the Artemis II mission, we'll have Jeremy Hansen from Canada going to the moon. And his patch, and thank you for that lovely land acknowledgement earlier, his patch was designed by an Anishinaabe artist from Manitoba, working with a number of the First Nations in Canada and Métis and Inuit peoples to really acknowledge the wisdom and heritage that we have in looking heavenward on this continent. And I'm so glad that we're going to hear more about that today. But we have that Artemis II mission. We also have the amazing amount of new information that's coming from a great collaboration between Canada, the United States, the Europeans on the James Webb Telescope. We have some great Canadian technology up there, whether it's the fine guidance sensor or whether it's the near-infrared imager that is allowing us to see exoplanets for the first time. And it's an amazing level of cooperation that is bringing us a new understanding of the universe that we live in that previous generations, in fact, folks 5 years, 10 years ago, would never have dreamed possible. So this is the right time for this session. Thank you so much to Bowling Green, and thank you to our panel for making this possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bird. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Kate Dellenbush, our moderator, and our moderator for the discussion this evening. Dr. Dellenbush is a teaching professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy here at BGSU, and she also directs the BGSU Planetarium, so she's having a tremendously busy year, and we're very thankful for her time this evening. She, like our speakers, knows about eclipses, so it is time for me to step aside and give her the podium. Dr. Dellenbush, thank you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to join with the History Department that we don't always get to do at BGSU to have a great interdisciplinary collaboration. And so I'm just going to speak for a few minutes to give a little bit of an overview about eclipses before our main programs this evening. All right, I'm actually going to kind of jump ahead a little bit here because I don't want to take up too much time. And if you've been to our lecture series already this semester, in our beginning of that a few weeks ago, you've seen some of this already. And eclipses are really about shadows, so I'm actually going to jump a little bit here. To give us a little bit of an overview about eclipses, what matters is what's casting a shadow on what. And of course, for an eclipse, the things that matter are the Earth, Sun, and Moon, and how they're lining up, and which one is casting a shadow on which. And for a solar eclipse, like we're going to have here coming up on April 8th, with a solar eclipse, it's the Moon that's casting a shadow onto the Earth, and we need to be in just the right place in order to see that special event of an eclipse. And in my picture here of my little eraser there casting a shadow, we can see that there's a dark inner part here, and a weaker outer part. And so whether we're in the moon's shadow within the dark inner part or the outer part really affects our experience that we have of the eclipse. And so if we look at not a scale model here, but of how things are lined up, we can see for a solar eclipse, the moon's in the way of our view of the sun, and if it's lined up just exactly right, so it's perfectly in front of the sun, it's blocking almost all of the light from the sun for just a few minutes. And you can see the dark inner part of the shadow there, and if we happen to be on the surface of the Earth within that portion, there we'll get to see a total solar eclipse. And if we're out in the weaker part of the shadow, we just get a partial eclipse. So let's see what that looks like. I guess I don't want to go too far away from the microphone, but over on the right-hand side there, we've got a couple of diagrams, and we'll just focus on the one on the left there of the little sketches. And you can see the moon's casting the shadow where there's that dark inner part. And so if we're in that region A there, we're going to get a total solar eclipse like we're going to have in April. And so we'll see something like the picture in the top right there, right? The special magical total solar eclipse. For people who aren't right along what's called the path of totality, they're out in that weaker, lighter gray kind of part, or labeled C portion, and they're just going to see a bite taken out of the sun. But the closer they are to the inner shadow, the bigger a bite they get to see. But for us here in Bowling Green and across a strip of North America, we get to see the special totality. And here we can see what that shadow looks like actually falling on the Earth from an earlier total solar eclipse. And let me try one thing here. See if it's going to work. Maybe not. All right. I'll use this instead. So we can see that this path of totality, the yellow strip there, that's where folks can see the special totality event, starts actually off in the Pacific Ocean that we can't quite see here, and then it kind of hits land in Mexico and crosses Mexico and then enters the United States in Texas and cuts across the United States, entering Ohio and up kind of skirting the border between the United States and Canada along Lake Erie, and then kind of fully goes into Canada and then back out into the ocean again in the Atlantic. And so to give you a little bit of an idea of that progression, here I've put times with Eastern times for us, but it'll start on Earth, basically, at 12:40 p.m. Eastern time, and then we can see it progresses across the continent throughout the sequence. So everyone along that narrow strip gets to see the special totality. I think we're up at time, is that right? We're good? Okay. All right, so let me give a little bit of a view of what we'll get to see. So here we've got a composite image throughout the sequence of totality, where we can see the moon just starting to move across in front of the disk of the sun, taking a bigger and bigger bite out of the sun, until for that special few minutes, for us here in Bowling Green, it'll be about 3 minutes of totality, where the moon's perfectly lined up with the sun, and we just see the outer atmosphere of the sun that normally we don't get to see. And then, of course, the Earth continues to spin on its axis, right? Everything's continuously moving, and so that doesn't last very long, and we move on to the second half where less and less of the sun is eclipsed again until it's just back to a normal day once again. And so hopefully, clear skies permitting, we'll get to see something like this where we've got this special totality and see something that's really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity without traveling someplace else on Earth in order to see a total solar eclipse. All right, I think I'm probably out of time, so I will turn things over here. Let me try to close this, though. All right, we're going to move on to one of our main speakers this evening. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Randall Rosenfeld, our keynote speaker this evening. And Mr. Rosenfeld is the Society Archivist and Director of the Dorner Telescope Museum at the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. And he has curated a notable archive that provides an insight on the development of Canadian astronomy in the last century, and is also published widely on material culture related to astronomy. And also has the distinction of having an asteroid named after him as well. So it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Rosenfeld.
Thank you, Kate. And just going to get this up. Great, I can't even recognize my own PowerPoint. I think that's it. I even hit the right button. In theory, is that it? We're almost there. Remarkable. I have to begin by thanking Judge Reddin and his family for founding, being the patrons of the symposium. The other thing I have to say is I'm incredibly pleased with how Bowling Green State University has taken this opportunity provided by the natural world of just really getting into planning for an eclipse. And of course, you know I would say that because I'm interested in astronomy, but I appreciate it nonetheless. And I'm very grateful to the organizers and the people who've done the logistics to get me and Frank here. It's very much appreciated. So I'm going to talk about old stuff and eclipses. But this old stuff has a direct connection to our experience now, or will. So when the sublime comes calling, and what do I mean by that? I'm going to give you a quote from Isabel Martin Lewis. She was one of the first professional female astronomers hired by the United States Naval Observatory, and her big thing was eclipses. She spent a lifetime predicting them and trying to refine those predictions. What does she say? The phenomenon of a total eclipse of the sun, the most sublime and awe-inspiring sight that nature affords. People are then more than at any other time brought into touch for a few fleeting moments with forces over which they can have no control, and the thought awes them and brings with it an unconscious feeling of humility. Once seen, it is a phenomenon never to be forgotten. I'm going to come back to this quote at the very end because it has a certain resonance with what I'm hoping you guys are going to experience if the weather cooperates. A total solar eclipse is different from other celestial events you can see from the Earth. Very different. A gamma ray burst or a supernova or the forming of an impact crater, well, they can be cataclysmic in their sphere of influence, if you like. You just think of the bad day for the dinosaurs. But the vast majority of these can't be detected, with our naked eyes. But it's different with a total solar eclipse, very different, because that's an event which overwhelms the environment if you're in the path of totality. It feels as if it should be cataclysmic, but it isn't. And this is one case where perspective actually counts. At least we tell ourselves it's not cataclysmic. So, tonight I'm going to explore these eclipse experiences through artifacts, and I'm going to cross 4 centuries. These are mostly drawn from Canadian sources. Well, most of these are in the archives, the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. There are advantages and disadvantages to doing this. So, eclipse artifacts, there's stuff you can reach out and actually touch. They've got a physical presence. You can hold them up to the light. If they've survived in good enough workable shape, you can actually observe through them. And there's one case, so Transit of Venus, last one was in 2012. We had out, a colleague of mine had out an 18th century Gregorian telescope. It's the sort of telescope that Thomas Jefferson could have used. He had this out, and they were doing public outreach. And he had it out so people could line up and see the eclipse through this more than 200-year-old telescope. And that's a good example of being able to reach out and actually touch the past and engage with it in the present. So, artifacts can be bridges between their makers and users and us. They may be keys to unlocking aspects of our predecessors' eclipse experiences and discovering the familiar and the unfamiliar, and those experiences can only enrich our own experiences. The limitation of this approach There's a lot we don't know about an artifact. It's just a matter of chance. They don't come out of the ground or out of a personal archive or a library telling their whole stories, telling who made them and why. So, first artifact. And it's striking how often an eclipse is found at important points in the development of Canadian astronomy. I could probably say the same thing for astronomy in Mexico or the United States. The earliest documented use of a telescope for astronomy in Canada was very late in January of 1646, and that's only 4 years after the death of Galileo, and that amazes me. This thing was a research quality telescope in the middle of what became Canada before 1650. In a way, it blows my mind. Yes, the occasion was an eclipse, but it was a lunar eclipse. Father Bersani's observation made the rounds of Europe. It went through the epistolary, that's the letter exchange. You got these scholars, astronomers, they send letters to each other. It was also a way of publishing at the time. So, no less a figure than Pierre Gassendi reported, and I quote, "I received letters from the middle of the region of North America of the Hurons, from the house of the Society of Jesus, and the place called St. Mary." That's St. Mary among the Hurons now. This letter was sent by the excellent Bersani, in which he reported that he had observed with an exceptional telescope. He had observed the most delicate beginning of the darkening of the moon in eclipse. Well, as I said, artifacts don't always come with their stories attached. There's a lot about this observation and the telescope we don't know. Did Father Bersani discuss the eclipse and different cosmological systems with the Huron members of the mission? Don't know. Did any of them cooperate with him in actually making the observation? Did any of the Huron tribe actually the Huron nation, look through the telescope? We just don't know. And what about the telescope? If it survived, it would be a very important piece of the scientific revolution, particularly for Canada. Well, it doesn't. And this is actually an accurate picture inside the frame there of what survives of the telescope. It doesn't, unfortunately. But not all is lost, because as we speak, it's being reconstructed now. And I'm particularly interested to find out what the use of this full working reconstruction can tell us about 17th century eclipse technology. Second artifact. In 1868, 8 men of relatively humble station banded together to form the Proto-RASC. During their first year, their greatest sense of accomplishment and purpose came from planning a campaign to observe a total solar eclipse of 1869 in August from Toronto. There was one problem with that. They weren't in the path of totality, but they planned their campaign as if they were. I guess confidence over experience, I don't know. They thought they'd see things like Bailey's bead or the diamond ring effect. Well, that was not going to happen. However, people have often noted there's a real bonding effect if you're at a situation where you're with other people to see an eclipse. And quite often, friends are made for life through that. And that's what happened with this group of the RASC. It actually strengthened the group's coherence. Well, this artifact here, it's actually the earliest document we have to do with anything with the RASC. The reason I'm showing it to you is because of what's on its back. So it's the original bylaws. On the back, someone at that time, a member of that group in Toronto, noted the timings of the eclipse observations, which is sort of cool, and at the same time, it's almost like someone taking, a copy of Magna Carta or Constitution of the United States and using it for notes for a scientific project. Those are more important documents, but there's a bit of that there. You wouldn't do that, I wouldn't do that. So this perhaps reveals something of Victorian attitudes to official working documents. And it also offers a way to capture a trace of the immediacy of an eclipse observation, because these people just turned this document over and noted what they were seeing. We actually have a document in the archives from the 1890s by a judge who was an amateur astronomer. And it's a legal document. He just turned it over and did a drawing of transit of Mercury, which is sort of cool, and I'm glad it survives. Good for that judge. Here we go. Third artifact, right over there. There have been popularizers of astronomy since the 18th century. The ones you mostly hear about were in England, there were some in France, but they're also here as well. They would have been New England at the time. So this was made by Mary Proctor. She was English. She's the daughter of Richard Proctor, again, an important English popularizer of astronomy, the latter half of his career was spent in the States, and most of her career was in the States and partly in Canada. This is her naked eye sketch of totality. And you can see solar prominences and coronal streamers. And this is during the eclipse of 1896, August the 9th, off Norway. And it's sort of cool. Totality reveals parts of the solar atmosphere you can't normally see. What we normally see is the photosphere. It's about 6,000 degrees Celsius. Above it's the chromosphere, and that's where you get those red things. And above that is the corona. And that's at between, I think, 1 million and 2 million degrees. It's pretty hot. So at that time, drawings of these rarely seen features were scientifically valuable. Remember, in a way, photography is still a bit in its infancy. And they were aesthetically fascinating because they show the sun in an unaccustomed light. You only saw those outer bits of the solar atmosphere during an eclipse. And what's interesting here is that these are really complex things to draw. And if you're an astronomical artist, you only had a short time, sometimes just less than a minute, to get that stuff down. And it's really, during an eclipse, there's a lot of tension. So this was a real challenge for people doing that. Mary's image was widely reproduced in woodcuts, and this also shows the difficulty in going from medium to medium. Because even a quick look at this shows that these are much more hard and angular than in her sketch. Anyways, if it's clear here on April the 8th, you're going to be able to see those outer bits of the solar atmosphere with your naked eye. So that's something to keep in mind. Fourth artifact, a chap named Weatherby. He's a Toronto-based accountant and an amateur astronomer. He observes the eclipse of 1900, May 28th, from the Muskoka region. Again, where he's observing from, he's only going to see 75% of the eclipse. How does he choose to record it? Birch bark. It's unusual and it's evocative. It's a charming choice. It recalls hardwood forests in North America and a way of life where people made their own stuff from what they found in the land. But the question is, are those the associations that this thing is meant to evoke? Around 1900, a lot of settlers, I'm a settler, well, my ancestors were, a lot of settlers thought that they were the ordained successors to the First Nations as possessors of the Americas, and that First Nations and their cultures were inevitably doomed to extinction. It wasn't always expressed as a triumphalist thing. Occasionally it was elegiac. And I guess it wasn't grating at the time, but it sure is now. So could that be the ideological framework of this document? It might be. We don't know enough to say. It's possible that Weatherby meant both of those associations to be there. It's also possible that Weatherby himself could have been First Nations. I just don't know. But that stuff aside, the whatever ideological associations, it's really quite a pleasing thing as an object. And you have to admire that he chose this, because I don't know if any of you have worked on birch bark. If you make a mistake, you're sort of doomed. It's hard to correct. Erasers don't work. Anyway, so artifacts exist. They exist in a conceptual context that, in a way, we create. Our ideas, our own relationships with the past, and what we think the future is going to be. They may represent ideals which were once acceptable but aren't any longer. And how we handle that is a challenge. It's a test of us, right? And it's a continual test. There are likely no simple answers or even no right answer you can give for any of the problems an artifact from the past raises. But in that lies their real power. So you got here, this is the fifth. Oh yeah, love this. So, fifth artifact. This is from an album that belonged to the Canadian equivalent of the Astronomer Royal, the chief astronomer of Canada, W.F. King. In the later half of the 19th and first half of the 20th century, eclipse observations were organizational feats. You needed a scientific program. Once you had that, you needed a lot of labor, a huge monetary investment, and you needed people to run the stuff, you needed resources and ingenuity. People had to be recruited and trained, logistical arrangements made, and instruments designed and procured. It was big science before that term was even invented. But hovering over all of this was risk, and very big risk. You might not have arrived at the place you wanted to observe from on time. You know, think of 19th century ways of travel. So that might not have happened. Your instruments might have got damaged or lost when they were transported. And of course, you or your colleagues could become sick on the way there. But the worst risk, at least to the astronomers, was bad weather. They thought that was worse than anything else. They would put up with personal sickness if they arrived on time to record the eclipse, and it was clear. So much depended on being able to see totality. So, 1905, professional astronomy in Canada, it's on a roll. Canada's answer to the Royal Greenwich Observatory and the United States Naval Observatory gets built. It gets it gets support from both sides of the House. That's the equivalent of Congress agreeing to do something and carrying it through without any complaints. There must be some myth without, well, anyways. Same year, they're on this roll, Canadian government, federal government decides to bankroll an eclipse expedition, going to Labrador to see a total solar eclipse of the sun, pay for everything. They invite a bunch of astrophysicists, well, a handful of them, from the Royal Greenwich Observatory, and the Canadian government pays their way. Everything goes beautifully. Nothing gets lost, nothing gets busted. The camp sets up. They're able to mount the clocks and the instruments. They practice with them so they know exactly what they're doing. They're going to take the photographs. Everything works beautifully, except the weather. They saw nothing. It happens. Well, by 1905, the astronomical community was used to this sort of thing, this element of chance. And they'd long planned for what happens if things don't go well on your eclipse expedition. Not everything is lost. It's not like flushing the money down the toilet. So what do you gain? You gain expertise in acquiring and making instruments. You can reuse the instruments in other scientific endeavors. You gain expertise in organization, and you get to meet, you make scientific connections with other people on those expeditions. And those are of value when you go to do other things later on, other scientific projects. And you can gather data for other sciences. Geology, geography, botany, meteorology, anthropology. These things could still be harvested. Sometimes that was the only thing you could harvest. And there's a lesson in that for us. Looking forward to April the 8th. You should also make plans just in case there are clouds in front of the sun. But if there are clouds in front of the sun, depending on how thick it is, you're still going to see stuff. And here's an example. Astronomer Royal of Scotland, Charles Piazzi Smith, so the last name is Smyth. When he rose in social rank, he changed the pronunciation from Smith to Smythe. Anyways, he was a very good artist. 1851, they're faced with this, clouds in front of the sun. But what he did notice is that there were nice, well, really quite dramatic colored effects because of the eclipse. And this is what he made watercolors of. So those of you who are artistically inclined can keep that in mind. Sixth artifact. These or their equivalent are common at eclipses now. This is a Rask one, but I expect here on April the 8th, there's going to be a lot of orange ones looking up. Or there should be. So, the current technology of these is 50 years old, 25 years old, 5 years old, 1 year old. It depends who you talk to and how you frame your question. But my question is, how long have mass-produced, commercially available, inexpensive, and safe eclipse viewers been around? Well, eclipse watchers in antiquity, at least the educated ones, are the ones who left records. They were very concerned with visual safety. So here's Seneca. We don't know what he looks like, so just a cartoon. He recommends a liquid mirror. What's a liquid mirror? It's a bowl with water or oil in it. So you look at the reflection of the sun. That was considered to be safe then. Kate would tell us, don't do that now. There were other things, such as a camera obscura. So from antiquity up to the Enlightenment and into the early decades of the 20th century, nearly everyone preferred to make their own eclipse viewers. They didn't go out and buy them. They preferred to make their own, which I find fascinating. You could do this. So there are a few records from about really good opticians, people who made professional telescopes, 18th century, and they sold eclipse viewers. It was a very small part of their trade. But it seems most people just didn't bother to buy them. The rise of the modern mass-produced eclipse viewer, the sort of thing you guys are going to use on April the 8th, that happened over the course of just 7 years and 3 eclipses. It was really, really fast. The eclipses, 1925 to 1932, 2 of them were in North America, 1 in England. By the end of that, it became the trend and the custom to buy eclipse viewers. So, I've got to show you one of these. Here we go. That's one of those eclipse viewers. That's 100 years old, pretty much. And there's a bunch of nursing sisters wearing one. Well, each one wearing one. The fact that you guys are going to be using functionally a technology which is that old for safe viewing of the eclipse now sort of appeals to me. So now we come to the problem of borders. Borders can be difficult places in many ways. There may be few which can be approached without some level of tension. Even apprehension. We all know this going between Canada and the United States. And you've done it many times, nothing ever happens, but there's still a bit of tension. It's just natural. A good number of borders have been places of conflict at some time or another. Many borders are purely artificial. They're not created by the landscape, they're created by people. They are, in fact, artifacts. And all an artifact means is something made by art. Borders have certainly affected astronomers in the past. Many astronomical expeditions, they had to negotiate their passage across them. 2 transits of Venus, 1761, 1769. They're a case in point. They happened during the 7 Years' War, also known as the Indian Wars here, and in Canada, I believe. So, first transit, or at least the first transit occurred during that war, series of wars. What's striking is that the warring nation states in Europe at the time, they'd regularly allow astronomers from the people from the side they're fighting to cross their borders. They give them safe passage, and they'd help them in other ways, which is the sort of thing that I like that sort of thing. And I don't think now we'd be as good about that. Borders are also used to separate one area of study now from another. People talk about disciplines in universities. You've got English, you've got history, you have astrophysics. There, at least, a border has a use, because if it sets limits on a body of knowledge, it means you don't have to learn everything, which can be sort of useful. But eventually, you've got to cross those disciplinary borders if you want to create new knowledge. Then there's cultural borders. They can be every bit as contentious as political ones, perhaps even more so. So, belief in your own cultural superiority over groups you encounter along the way to your eclipse destination, that can empower your ability to learn from those cultures you encounter. I've got examples of that, Canadian eclipse expeditions going to the States. In 1869, there's one in particular where the person recording the stuff doesn't say complimentary things about the First Nations and African American communities he encounters. It's really embarrassing to read now. So, viewing the same phenomenon, we may perceive quite different things because our interpretations are affected by the cosmological systems we grew up with, that we hold personally, and our expectations of the natural world. You just think, an example, we map the sky differently. We put different mythologies up there. That needn't be, even though, that needn't really be a hard border. It depends on the attitude we have towards these cultural differences. But we have to be willing to cross those boundaries or take those borders down, which isn't always easy. So, the powerful emotions engaged by an eclipse may throw some of those cultural borders into high relief. And they can affect a greater understanding of cultural difference. So I'm going to close with the bookend to my opening. You recall the quote from Isabel Martin Lewis? Actually, you probably don't. I don't either. I'd have to go back and look at the slide, but never mind that. Let's pretend we do. So she's talking about the memorable emotional impact of eclipses. Keep in mind, she's one of the first professional woman astronomers. She's working for a national institution of the US government. She's a level-headed expert on eclipses. She specializes in their computation. Mathematics is her thing. Well, the 7th Astronomer Royal in England, Sir George Biddulary, he spoke of the emotional impact of eclipses in very similar words to his American counterpart, or his American colleague. And that is really striking, because the usual impression you have of Airy from reading contemporary sources is that he's a prototypical Victorian establishment scientist. He's methodical to the last degree. Everything has to be well planned out. And his approach to a problem is going to be mathematical, to almost any problem. So, there's one thing I want you to notice here. He's talking about I'm not going to read the whole thing, you can read it. He's talking about the horror of totality. And that's not the sort of thing you would think he would write. He's someone who's not supposed to be emotionally involved, but he writes that to his wife. So, my question is, looking at this, is it possible that this encounter with the sublime in a solar eclipse, did it give a scientifically trained astronomer, did it give him any sympathy with other cultures not from that tradition? And did that astronomer think that it caused him to reflect, him or her, that his own ancestors were the equivalent of those cultures, that their views would have been the same or similar? If it did, then that was one border he or she had crossed. And the ultimate artifact of witnessing a total solar eclipse of the sun is a memory of that event that each one of you is going to take with you. Thank you. Probably got on too long.
So this is actually for Randall, who asked about our orange eclipse glasses. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for the invitation to talk a little bit about Mexico. I have to say this is a teaser for a longer talk in the planetarium, March 22nd, I believe, right? At 7 p.m., I think. March 21st, sorry, where I'm going to deal more extensively with the history of eclipses in Mexico. Where I have my iPad thingy, give me a sec. Yes, I have to, I want to read a document and it's right there, but I want to be facing you guys, so give me just a sec. So, history of eclipses in Mexico, we can begin anywhere we want, right? And the low-hanging fruit will be, of course, Mesoamerica, right? And you can maybe recall the movie Apocalypto by Mel Gibson. Like the climax of the movie is a solar eclipse where the protagonist is spared his life because, oops, an eclipse happened in the middle of his planned human sacrifice. And it's a very interesting, I think, scene and a reconstruction of an eclipse in the Mayan world. The interesting thing is that from what we know, and I'm not a specialist in ethnoastronomy or astronomy at all, but what people tell me is that the Mayans have very sophisticated astronomical knowledge, and they have all the tools to be able to predict eclipses and to know when they were coming. So the movie is a little bit like, I don't know if the right word is insulting, but sort of the knowledge of the astronomical knowledge of the Mayans. The Aztecs had, so-called Aztecs, we prefer to call them Mexica or Nahua-speaking people, or Tenochca. The Mexica also had very sophisticated knowledge, astronomical knowledge. It's less clear if they could predict eclipses or not, but they were fascinated by eclipses, and for them it had like a very strong symbolic importance, as in different cultures. But if you think Mexica, Aztecs, and you think immediately of the calendar, they like keeping time. They were willing to change time and chronology just to match a solar eclipse. If they could make like an emperor be born like a year earlier so it matched a solar eclipse, they would change the chronicles to do that, right? But the story of, or the significance of eclipses in Mexico does not finish there by any stretch of the imagination, right? More recently, in the 19th century and the 20th century, as I was reading the newspaper reports and other sources, I find like a story that it's very similar to what Randall was talking about in the case of the Royal Astronomical Society, like this gradual professionalization of astronomy, but also like this strong sense that we are part of something that is global, that Mexico, forging its path as an independent nation, it's part of this bigger concert of nations that has science at its root, right, as part of its identity of what is modern. And so they organized like astronomical watch parties like what Randall was showing, and invited people from Europe, the case I recall particularly was from Germany and the United States, to come over and witness eclipses, observe the eclipses in different locations at the same time. In 1918, I believe, I may not recall the year exactly, they organized a similar party, watch party. I call it a party, but maybe an expedition would be a better way to call it. And the great drive was to try Einstein's relativity theory. And it was cloudy, and the report said, we regret that we could not have done this. And I think the year after, there was another solar eclipse somewhere else where it was, I don't recall exactly the history of that, but Mexico could have been the first place where the relativity theory was proved via the observation of eclipses. So that was like a big national disappointment, you know. So the history of eclipses is tied to this history of construction of nations, and more broadly to power. Now, I wanted to bring up, if I have a little time, this eclipse of 1691 that no one knows, well, yeah, people like me knows about, because we are history nerds, but few people know about. It's in the middle of the colonial period. And no one likes writing about the middle of the colonial. You write at the beginning because it's conquest, or you write at the very end because it's independence. No one cares about the middle. But the middle is super interesting, the middle colonial, in part because of people like the one who wrote this document. And let me show him to you. So this guy, oh, I have a mouse problem here. Yeah, this guy, good-looking dude. Carlos de Sigüenza y Góngora. He is considered today the most prominent scientist of the colonial era. Still, we would call him a polymath, a person of many traits and knowledge. He was appointed as the professor of astrology in the University of Mexico. And he tried all his life to change the title to astronomy, because astrology at that point could be interpreted as astronomy, but also as what we call today astrology. And so he wanted to clearly designate that part of the scientific revolution, that this is science. We are not about going about things that are not observable. And he kept like an observatory in the university. He published regularly the calendar of Mexico City. The calendar actually had like the anticipated like astronomical events of the year. And luckily, 1691, luckily for him, he knew that there was going to be an eclipse. August 23rd, 1691. And so he prepared everything, 8:15 a.m., as they anticipated, the eclipse started. And he wrote this description later on about it. In this way, we reached to the, let me read it from here. In this way, we reached to the 23rd of August, in which, as announced in almanacs and forecast, the sun eclipsed. If your mercy, the viceroy to whom he's writing this, if your mercy would know anything about astronomy, I tell you here with its own terms 1,000 good and quaint details that I observed that day, as it was not only a total eclipse, but one of the biggest that the world has seen. Shortly after 4:85 in the morning, we entered into not a good, but a bad night. The darkness in which for almost a quarter hour we found ourselves was the most terrifying. Going back to the horror story, right? And the mood. Given that it was not expected, at the same time that the light went away, the birds that were flying fell down to the ground. The word he used in Spanish is cayeron, fell down, like dropped to the ground. The dogs howled, the women and the children screamed, and the Indian women left the stalls in which they sold produce in the plaza and ran at full speed to the cathedral. The bells tolled at the same instant, not only the cathedral, but in all the churches of the city, causing sudden confusion and horrific outcries. Meanwhile, I was with my quadrant and telescope contemplating the sun. I was happy to an extreme and repeatedly giving God, I think I'm reading from this, but and repeatedly giving God thanks for having given me the opportunity to see an event that occurs in a certain place so infrequently and something of which there are so few observations. One interesting thing that he captured later on, and I'm here more paraphrasing, was that the moon covered the heart of the lion, which reminded me of the image that Kate used, and he saw Venus very bright, but he also talked about some atmosphere around the moon, right? And that's the corona. And we were talking with Andy Leiden a few minutes ago that maybe, I mean, they did not know what the corona was, right? And lastly, from 8:30 to 9:30, the air was so cold as if it were winter, as other astrologers have frequently said, right? And I wanted to bring this piece simply as an example of astronomical knowledge and the cultivation of that knowledge in Mexico, but also because I do think that 1691 was 3 eclipses in one, right? One was Carlos's eclipse, right? He was happily observing. The other one was the eclipse of the people down there on the streets in the city. He was on the roof of a palace watching this. The people were down there screaming, running to the cathedral, right? People that, according to him, were so terrified by what they were seeing that the memory of that eclipse they carried forward, and a year later they almost murdered the viceroy in a rebellion that was narrated for centuries in Mexico. And I think there's also a third eclipse, and for that you will need to wait for my talk on March 21st, and that's the eclipse of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, like the most distinguished poet of Mexico, even today considered like a peak of literature, comparable to the highest glories of among the highest glories of the golden century of literature in the Spanish world. She kept like a whole collection of instruments, astronomical instruments, was the best friends with our good-looking dude here. Well, I lost the photo, of Carlos Sigüenza y Góngora, and we know nothing about what she wrote, what she experienced that day, and I think it's a nice speculation. I think this speaks of different borders as well, social borders and cultural borders, right? The experience of Carlos Sigüenza y Góngora, the scientist, the experience of the people, the experience of a nun in a convent that is gaining global recognition, but somehow could not come to grips to write about this experience, and I find that fascinating. Thank you.
So next we're going to move on to our next speaker, Dr. Sarah Reynolds, and she's an assistant professor in the Department of Physics and Earth-Space Science at the University of Indianapolis, where she teaches physics, astronomy, and introductory science courses for pre-service educators. And she holds a PhD in the history of science, focusing on 19th century history education, and is also the creator of The Sun, the Moon, and the Hoosier State podcast. So this evening she's going to present Revealing the Sun Anew, Solar Eclipses and Scientific Development.
Thank you. Oh, let me see if I can get this figured out for just a moment. All right, there we go. Now I can look at you guys and talk. So thank you so much. It's great to be here, and I really appreciate all the wonderful faculty and staff at Bowling Green State University and the Reddin Fund and other organizers for putting this together. I've enjoyed what I've gotten to hear and talk about with people so far, and hopefully we get to do a little bit more. So the sky drives daily life here on Earth in patterns that are familiar and recognizable to us all from the youngest ages, right? Just every day you wake up and you know it's a day because the sun is going to rise and the sun's going to go through the sky and then the sun's going to set. And then, at some point during that day, the moon's probably going to be doing something. It's not all at night. It's also sometimes during the day. So you got to kind of watch for it. But so we notice these things about, when the sun is up and how it's going to illuminate our communities and our lives. And we also notice the moon and the stars. We talk about them in our stories, and we depict them in our music and our art. And we study these things. Some of us study them professionally, but they're also things that we include in education and we learn about in our classrooms. And I'm even sometimes amazed nowadays how I'll talk with like 4-year-olds that can tell me about the dwarf planet Maki Maki, right? How many of you can do that? I was given very good information by a 4-year-old about the dwarf planets, and I was impressed. So along with that, we know that ancient people groups were also paying attention to the sun, the moon, and the stars. And they did that for very sensible reasons, right? Because tracking those things allowed them to have expectations about agriculture and the change of seasons. It helped them to navigate, it helped them to track time. And so many of our calendar systems and ways of thinking about how the year works are based on these kinds of cycles. So this is an image here that comes out of, there's an upcoming NASA mission called Punch, which is all studying the corona and the heliosphere. And the mission is not launched yet, but their outreach team has done a lot of great work already, especially in the southwest region of the US, working to understand how ancient people in that region were viewing the skies and looking up there. And so this is the view from the Great Kiva in one of the pueblos in Chaco Canyon. And what you notice in this example is that certain things about the construction of that are aligned with these certain places that you have significant dates in the calendar of the solar year, right? So solar solstices and equinoxes tend to be reflected in a lot of construction that we find from ancient times. So that's one of the indications we have that people were keeping track of these things. All right, I'm going to try clicking arrows instead of the thing. We find this all around the world in a whole number of different cultures, right? So there's a couple examples here. We have eclipse records in cuneiform. We have astronomical measurements and observations recorded. This is on a ceiling in a tomb in Egypt. Going well back, right? Thousands of years, actually, BCE, we have some examples. One of the earliest is this, I think it's called Nabta Playa calendar circle. It's kind of like Stonehenge. That's the sort of megalith that people are usually familiar with, except this one was in Africa and in southern Egypt, I think, and happened like thousands of years before Stonehenge. So these sorts of constructions give us a clue that people were watching and paying attention to these things. And so with all that, I think we have this really interesting realization that people paid attention to the sky because it was important for them. But when something dramatic would happen in that sky, right, that would also change things about the way that they were looking at and paying attention to it. Solar eclipses have this way of kind of interrupting or standing out and challenging us as the sun that we depend on so much in our lives is suddenly blocked from view. But at the same time it's blocked, it sort of is revealed to us in new ways. And one of those ways is the solar corona we've heard quite a bit about. You actually can't see the solar corona regularly because the surface of the sphere is so bright and overwhelming, you just can't see this part of the sun. And so it was a gradual process of recognition in different cultures, like, what's that funny ring? Oh, that's actually something real, you know. And, you know, were they calm enough and paying attention enough to record that and observe it over time? In some cases, yes. In other cases, maybe drawing pictures of the solar corona was not their highest priority at the moment. But so the corona is revealed, and there's certain scientific knowledge that is revealed, but there's also just the basic fact that this can happen, right? That you could have a different kind of world. You could have a world where the sun is not a star that shows up in your sky every day. You could have a world where maybe a star is farther away. You can have a world where the temperature gets colder, and you could have a world where the sky darkens, right? So all of these are things that, you know, give us a little glimpse of like, oh, what's going on up there has an impact on us, on our daily lives, even beyond the regular version that we see every day. And so I think what you see in all of this is you see the sort of impetus that drives a lot of science, where people look at this and they ask new questions, they develop some new ideas, and they wonder, is this going to happen again, and how do we know? So one of the things that I think this teaches us about science is that science can be broader than we sometimes really think about. And this is important when we think about science and its history. So you can even think, what is science, right? How would you define it? What does it mean to you when someone says that word? And when we tell the history of science, what should we include? Who should we include? Is it about a single tradition? Does it start with the scientific revolution? Is there science before that? Is there science in other cultures around the world? And I would say yes, that science is actually something that, especially in eclipses, we can recognize some broad, we can recognize broadly, right? We see people having some similar kinds of reactions and some similar kinds of activities in response. And this challenges our ideas of science, because we might normally, sometimes we think about it as a particular discipline or a certain kind of activity. When I was growing up, science was all the stuff that you learned in the green textbook. You know, you had a red textbook for math and a blue textbook for social studies, and I think purple was like literature, but green was science. And so that's how I knew when it was science. But sometimes we also think about it as a particular methodology, right? We think, oh, well, there's the scientific method, and when someone follows that, then it's real science. But the scientific method is a relatively recent development. It's not even fully applicable in every field of science that we use today. We know it has a lot of variations, and we know that a lot of the classic scientists that we think of as exemplars weren't using that method. They predated it. So we have to kind of think about, how do we define science a little bit more broadly? And when we look at people's responses to eclipses over time, we see people asking these kinds of questions and carrying out a lot of behaviors that are the sort of characteristics that we think of as science. I'm going to go past that slide and go straight on. So some of that is observation and recording, right? This is a petroglyph from Chaco Canyon that is thought to maybe be a representation of an early solar eclipse. Archaeoastronomy is hard, right? It's very hard to know what people were drawing and thinking and how they, it's hard even in regular history, and then you go back a few thousand years. So, but this is a representation that seems to coincide time-wise with a time there would have been a solar eclipse, and it would have been a solar eclipse that has at a time of high solar activity. And when the eclipse happens and you have high solar activity, you tend to get a rounder eclipse with a lot more protrusions, okay? So if you start really paying attention to eclipse pictures, you'll notice they look a little different. And some of them are a little rounder, and some of them are a little bit more lobed. And this would have been at a time when they had an eclipse when it would have been very round. So that's one example. There's also a really interesting example that's a piece that was recovered from a shipwreck called the Antikythera mechanism. And it's a mechanical device thought to be from about 80 BCE. And one of the interesting things is that if you look at the teeth on the device and try to figure out, okay, what is this representing? It seems to coincide, part of it seems to coincide to the number of lunar months you have in a thing we call a Saros cycle. That's a lot of technical stuff for, somehow this seems to be a device for predicting eclipses and when they could occur. And so you may have had people even creating some sort of like calculation device that long ago that would help them predict some of this stuff. And then you of course have, you know, the progression of that all the way to the present, getting into the present day, where you have science starting to look more like the science we're familiar with. But even then, right, different methods, different strategies, sometimes different emphasis. There's a whole period where they're looking for a planet that nowadays we're pretty sure doesn't exist, right? But that was a big focus of what they did during eclipses in the 19th century. So I think in a lot of these things, right, as we start seeing that curiosity, question asking, observation, measurement, prediction, all of these are things we can recognize as science sort of broadly. So given that broad definition of science, I'm going to talk about three particular areas in which we find solar eclipses impacting and revealing the development of science. We see changes in scientific knowledge and practices. right, I'll try to get to the right part of the slides. We see changes in scientific knowledge and practices. We see changes in science's interaction with society, and we see impacts upon people themselves. And some of these we've already had some good examples of tonight, so hopefully this will sound a little familiar. So one of the things that solar eclipses do, first of all, is prompt questions of how and why they are occurring. And so there might be other answers to that, right? Sometimes those things are answered by religious explanations or other cultural explanations or explanations that put the eclipse in as an event in a larger history of our society. But there's also, a basic sort of scientific thing of, is there a motion or a relationship that I can kind of find in these? And so you find people looking for these repeatable patterns of when and where eclipses would occur. And a lot of societies realize pretty quickly that this is an alignment of the sun and the moon. And so you can kind of start to construct an explanation and a model and be able to do some tracking and prediction. Now, predicting eclipses is complex. Really not good at this clicking while I'm talking thing, am I? So predicting eclipses is complex. Go on. Partly because you have a complicated set of three-dimensional dynamics. You have the motion of the Earth, the Moon, and the Sun, and their orbits all relative to each other. And so as that gets kind of put together, right, why is it so hard to predict? Partly it's because those motions are complicated. When we draw them in a simple diagram, we tend to make them look a little bit easier. So I just want to point out that these diagrams that you see are usually not to scale. They're not three-dimensional, which is really important for understanding why we don't get a solar eclipse every month. And they're not dynamic, so they don't show you the subtleties of the ways the moon's orbit varies a little bit back and forth. And so when we talk about people trying to figure out these cycles over time, that's the complexity that they're trying to piece together. And they're trying to do that in periods where you have uncertainties of weather, and you don't have a coordinated global time. You don't necessarily have global networks of communication, so you may not know that an eclipse just happened somewhere on the world. And so you can kind of see how challenging this would have been. If you look at a map today, this is a map of eclipse paths from 2001 to 2040. And you can see, right, what a wide variety of those paths there are all over the world. And so even though an eclipse happens about once or twice a year somewhere on Earth, the exact type of eclipse and the path of the eclipse varies enough that any one location could go centuries before an eclipse happens there again. And that's if the weather cooperated both times, right? So it's very tricky to collect the data, and yet you find people doing that. You find people making records, collecting records from around the world as they explore and they start to find these reports, and then putting them together to understand something about eclipses and predict them better. So for a long, long time, the main goal in studying eclipses was that. It was prediction, explanation, basic sort of geometry kind of stuff, and doing better at knowing when they were going to occur and where. As you reach the 19th century, there starts to be a change that occurs. And this change occurs partly because there's other discoveries coming out of other areas of science that are kind of changing the way that we look at the world in general. And a big part of that are developments in physics and chemistry. One of the things those do is they change our understanding of light and how we see it. And some of those early light studies were things that were coming from studies of sunlight in the first place. So in 1802, you have William Hyde Wollaston, and he first notes that if you take a prism and you break sunlight into its component colors, they've been doing that for a while, but this makes what we call a spectrum, that smear of color. But when he noted that you could find certain areas in that were dark lines at certain colors. And Joseph Fraunhofer picks up on that a little bit later. He comes from a German family of glassmakers, and he starts making devices to do that better and to measure and record exactly where these lines occur. And he finds that there's over 500 individually identifiable dark lines in the solar spectrum. And that ends up driving investigation that happens in the laboratory as well as with sunlight, in looking at how light can give us information about a source. So they start to realize that light can actually tell you about the temperature, the composition, and the motion of the source that it's coming from. Once you have that information, all of a sudden stars that are incredibly far away and you can't ever, bring into your lab and stick a thermometer in, all of a sudden you have a new way of getting information about them. And they start to put all these pieces together. But that's a big job, and it involves a lot of people over a lot of time working on investigating this. So it's a substantial change in astronomy, and it leads to what a lot of people at the time call a new astronomy. Today we might call it the rise of astrophysics. Here's one example where he talks about, and he's connecting it again specifically to eclipse studies and what they're seeing from the sun. But this new astronomy meant that an eclipse was no longer just an opportunity to talk about the motions of things and try to understand the sun better. It was also a time that you could actually investigate things about light, about heat, about energy, about processes that we have going on here, as well as out there in the sun and with the moon. Now, at the same time, you have a lot of other changes in the 19th century in how they're doing science. You have new methodologies, new types of experimentation. You have a new push towards standardization. And one of my favorites when they're working with eclipses and standardization, you can see this, they start thinking about how should you blindfold people before totality hits? Because they know that you're going to get the best results of drawing the corona if your eyes are dark adapted, and it takes a certain amount of time for that to happen. So you have to kind of like line up your corona drawers and blindfold them, or do this at different locations, have everyone blindfolded 15 minutes in advance so that they can do the corona drawings and they'll be hopefully equally good at it. So you start to have these kinds of coordinated networks also appearing as they work on standardization and communication of results across these different borders and boundaries. So by 1894, David Todd writes in the preface to his wife Mabel's book that it's been a half-century golden age of physical research upon the sun, and a lot of it is driven by these studies carried out during eclipses. But Mabel Loomis Todd's, she's got a long name, her book serves also as a good entry point to the second area that I want to mention, that through eclipses we see differences in the way science interacts with society. So Mabel Loomis Todd is talking about eclipses and eclipse studies and the new scientific knowledge, but she's also presenting a certain image of what science is and what science does and how science works in society. She's presenting a science where she emphasizes the significance and the importance of scientific work, but she's also talking about technology and innovation and how scientists need funding in order to travel, in order to get the equipment that they need to do their work. So she's part of this sort of transition. While she's promoting the scientific community, she's also presenting science as sort of a form of entertainment that the everyday person can engage with as well, and emphasizing that the scientist isn't actually the best person to enjoy an eclipse because they're busy. Actually, regular people are the best people to enjoy an eclipse because they actually get to sit there and notice it. And so these relationships between science and the larger community are being captured in these things. You find this emphasis on technology and innovation, I think, is also fascinating too, because it shows you how changes that are happening in society are always reflected when we come to look at the eclipse. When you have new forms of media, What do people do? They use them for the eclipse. As soon as radio broadcasting is available, they radio broadcast eclipses. How do you radio broadcast an eclipse, right? It's mostly a visual experience, but they talk about it, they describe it, they put it on the radio. When film is first invented, both daguerreotypes, photographic film, and then when they start doing actual movies, what do? You make ones about the eclipse, you record that, and you show that event. And so we're always bringing our latest developments in society to the eclipse and to our ways of talking about and communicating around it. We do also find, and I think this has been pointed out, multiple examples of how eclipse knowledge often is sort of acting at the interface between cultures. Sorry, don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to skip a little bit. I'm not going to tell you about the cool telegraph part. You just need to know there's a cool telegraph part where they race the eclipse with the telegraph. You can ask me more about it later. But I want to just talk a little bit about this interaction between cultures, right? You find multiple cases where eclipses are being sort of wielded. But along with that, right, in all those cases, there's certain claims about what science is doing in those societies, right? That science is a form of authority or a form of power, or that the people that have that knowledge are somehow superior, which of course is a false indicator, right? Science does not make a society superior all on its own. It doesn't make people good, it doesn't make society just. It's one part of a whole complex network of what's going on in a society. But the way that people talk about and present that science often is using this kind of idea that our science is a reflection of our worth and our value and what we have accomplished as a society. Can be a good thing, can also be a real problem. And so this is where I want to get to that last point, which is that people interact with science in a real diversity of ways, right? Ultimately, I think one of the biggest impacts on science and reflections of science throughout the centuries is what science does with the individual person who sees an eclipse. There are the scientists who are out there observing, measuring, and all of that, but there's many other people that interact with the eclipse that are using it for business, are using it for industry, are using it for art and creativity. And so you also find so many people that are drawn into science or start using science in new ways after an eclipse because they've enjoyed that experience and they take that new places after it's over. So ultimately, a lot of the impact of science of eclipses on science is about that impact on people and the realization that a scientific phenomena is also a phenomena that is a human experience in the end. And even, I think, as we had a good illustration a moment ago, even the most staid scientific observer who knows and understands exactly what they're looking at in terms of the science up there, you can still go and watch them on eclipse day. And if they're not busy doing a lot of measurements, you will see them have that awe and wonder kind of reaction, even with all their scientific objectivity. So that's where I wanted to sort of end with, and I think I'm done. It's a horrible ending. Thank you.
All right, excellent. We've got one more speaker this evening, Mr. Frank Dempsey, and he's a retired meteorologist from Ontario and holds a Master of Science in Astronomy. He's also an avid amateur astronomer for his entire life and has viewed numerous eclipses. He's active in public outreach with the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada, serving on the Council of the Toronto Centre, and he's also a member of the Docus First Nation. He's going to tell us today about astronomy and star lore of Indigenous North Americans. Thanks.
Well, Ani, bonjour. That's all the Ojibwe I know. That's all I'm going to say. It means hello and welcome. Let me find the presentation here if we can find where it's parked. That's probably that one right there. And I think it's F5 usually does it. Okay, I guess we're all set to go. Start my timer here. So I just wanted to point out a few things that you might find interesting, hopefully, about the indigenous perspective of eclipses. And so I decided to start off with a bit of introductory star lore, just to give you some idea of the cycles that were recognized by indigenous peoples across North America. I think Sarah did a pretty good job already explaining some of the cycles, so I don't need to explain too much. But the other part of the presentation will be what I call natural observations, and that's what I think of as observations by people, whether indigenous North Americans, indigenous peoples around the world, anybody pre-civilization whose visions and sights and observations were not clouded by religious or social obstructions. So you see something naturally, you can interpret it. If you're clogged up by some overwhelming religious belief, then it might be a bit different. So I'll just get on to a brief introductory to some star lore here. I don't know if you can see that constellation, or can anybody recognize those stars that I've put there? Okay, Big Dipper. Okay, good, very good. So I decided to start off with a brief mythology introduction to what's commonly called the Big Dipper. So it's in astronomy is part of what's a constellation called Ursa Major. But this is how it appeared from my backyard a few nights ago. And if you look in the evening when it's clear, you'll see it rising in the east. You may see some trees here obstructing some things, but basically the Big Dipper is rising in the east, and this myth starts off in the springtime. And so with this myth, I'm starting off with the mythology of people that were across northeastern North America, eastern Canada, Canadian Atlantic provinces, and northeastern USA. In this particular myth, it starts off with the bear. And so this was seen as a bear by many indigenous peoples around North America, so including in North America. And so in this particular legend, the bear is seen climbing out of her den in the springtime. Springtime sky, it's climbing up in the northeast. The bear is emerging from her den. And so the den is the constellation that we also call Corona Borealis. You may recognize it as a C-shaped constellation. So it's seen as the bear's den, but minor detail here. The point is that the bear climbs out of her den. A very bright, bright star that we recognize as Arcturus. It's way off in the off the frame here. A bright star is seen as robin, the bird robin. So robin also emerges in the springtime and is very hungry, and decides to hunt the bear. Sees the bear. Everybody's really hungry. They're going to hunt the bear. So robin knows he's a tiny little bird and can't really do it himself. So he calls on his buddies, all the other birds that are emerging, to also help out in the hunt, the bear hunt. So one by one, the other creatures all get in line and start hunting the bear across the sky. And I think I had a diagram here. So I put in an extra diagram. I took out a few illustrations from a good software package called Stellarium. So I have a few illustrations from Stellarium. I thought this one was interesting because it marks off the Big Dipper as a bear with a tail. And if that were true, it would be the only bear in the universe known to have a tail. Okay, so this is the illustration I wanted to illustrate. And you can see again Big Dipper, and the bear has emerged, robin is closest. All these other birds are in line and they're going to chase the bear across the sky. So all through the spring and summer, the bear is climbing across the northern and western sky, and by autumn it's sinking into the west. By this time, the hunters are all pretty tired of chasing the bear. Bear is getting exhausted. They've chased the bear across the sky all year long, right into the autumn. So a picture of the autumn, this bear is sinking, this constellation is sinking into the western sky. And so the bear is sinking down. One by one, the other stars representing these are the birds that also were chasing the bear. They all drop out of the hunt because they're getting pretty exhausted. Robin is the last one that's remaining pretty close. And so in this myth of the Algonquin, robin is pretty close to the bear. Robin shoots an arrow into the bear, and the bear roars up on her hind legs, and she's shot, and so blood splatters all over, and the mouse falls down. You pick up the mouse. So blood splatters all over Robin, and Robin jumps up into the trees and shakes off the blood, and most of the blood splatters all over the trees and turns the maple trees red. except for a little spot that remains on Robin's breast that couldn't disappear. So meanwhile, the bear dies, and the bear's fat drops to the ground and covers the ground with snow for the winter. And meanwhile, during the winter, the bear, that constellation, moves slowly across the northern sky, and the cycle repeats again in the springtime. And so that's the cycle of the Algonquin explaining this Big Dipper constellation called the bear hunt. So it's, there's a few liberties involved. Of course, blood doesn't really turn the trees red, and the snow isn't really bear fat, but it's a good legend to illustrate one of the legends, and illustrating the cycles, is carrying on with what Sarah already pointed out, that cycles were pretty well observed by indigenous peoples, including the sun and moon. And another myth I considered mentioning is another one more in line with my own ancestors, Ojibwe. And this is actually the Fisher stars. I won't bother to explain it. I could explain it if you want to, but it's another hunted animal, and the bear ends up in the sky as seen as a fisher with an arrow in its tail. And there's a double star right here. You may be familiar with that constellation. The fisher has an arrow in the tail. And so there are numerous other explanations in the star lore for the Big Dipper, so I wouldn't want to mention them all, but there are quite a few of them, and so I'll just mention one of them to give you some idea of cycles as seen by the indigenous peoples. And so to get on with some other details I wanted to illustrate, I call it natural observations. And so I think of it, picture one thing to let you know about is that I'm a member of the RASC, which is Royal Astronomical Society of Canada in Toronto Centre, and one of the things I've been doing for a good 10 years or more is helping out with so-called public outreach, where we take our telescopes, set them up, and the public comes and looks through our telescopes, mostly for the first time at the sun or at the moon in the evening, first quarter moon or Saturn. And we do a solar viewing thing first Saturday of every month at the so-called Ontario Science Centre. But the point here is that thousands of people have looked through my telescope for the first time in their life, and I have to say that a lot of them say, "Oh, cool, neat," and walk away, and maybe they're impressed, maybe they are, but a small percentage of people, and I guess the educators in the room would be familiar with this, but a very small percentage of the people are keen observers, and they've never looked through a telescope before. I can tell because they look at my telescope, and sometimes I bring my homemade telescopes, and it's a plywood square tube, and it doesn't look like a telescope, but people look at it and think, "Wow, amazing." And so they've never looked through a telescope before, and some people are really keen observers, and they say to me things like, ask little details like, "Wow, what's that? Two dots beside Saturn, beside those other dots that you said are the moons." And I look again in the eyepiece and think, "Wow, they've got really good vision. They can see a lot of, maybe 5 of Saturn's moons, where I thought there were only 2 visible." Or they ask some question about some detailed crater shadow on the moon. And I think, wow, some people are pretty darn good observers. So I call them natural observations, that people are, their view is unclouded by any religious or other viewpoints, and they see things naturally. So I would say that being slightly prejudiced because I was a meteorologist for about 20 years, that clouds are a natural thing to watch for and predict weather and understand naturally. And so people who lived outside, hunted outside day and night, fished, hunted, made their living outside, were very familiar with clouds. There's no question about it. I should say, as far as paddling goes, I don't know if any of you do kayaking or canoeing, but if you do any kayaking or canoeing, you spend some time on the water, you become really familiar with a lot of signs, and you don't want storms to creep up on you. You want to be aware of clouds coming in, going out, leaving you with sunburn, that sort of thing. So people paddling also get quite a lot of natural observations. Anyway, let me go down to some other details here. I mentioned rainbows and clouds, aurora, zodiacal light, comets, meteors. There's some things which people may observe and may or may not understand. This rainbow in the top left, you commonly see pictures of rainbows as a big arc across the sky. And so it's not always that way. Sometimes it's a tiny little arc. And you may be aware that rainbows are caused by falling rain. And when they get illuminated just correctly by a shaft of sunlight coming at the right direction, mainly from behind you, illuminating some shower that's gone past you, you can get a part of a rainbow. So this was quite naturally obvious to a lot of people. In fact, I would say to anybody who lived and worked outside. Whereas somebody else may see pictures in a book or whatever and say, oh, that's not a rainbow arcs across the sky. But anyway, it's one little observation. Solar halo is another one that's people would recognize right away as incoming high ice clouds with incoming weather storms or systems. I put in a picture of a comet here. Some of you may remember Comet Neowise a few years ago, but that's one example where I would say pretty tough to guess what's going on there. So the point here is that not all observations are easily explainable or obvious to people who don't know about some physical science. So I mentioned the rainbow, and so it's actually caused by some refraction and reflection of light rays. And so here's a diagram explaining the rainbow. So I put this in to ask you, does somebody need to understand this to interpret a rainbow? My answer is no. You don't need to know all these details. You don't need to understand the refractive index of water or ice crystals or understand internal reflections of raindrops to explain a rainbow. You simply see falling rain go past you and a shaft of sunlight illuminating from the right direction, and that's all a natural observation needs to understand. So that's one observation that you don't need to know the mathematics involved here. So there are some other things. Here's an example of why I put in some illustrations from Stellarium. I took what I thought was a really good photograph of the summer Milky Way. This is from a really dark sky location that I go to sometimes in Manitoulin Island in Toronto, in Ontario, I should say. Very dark sky. I took what I thought was a really good picture of Milky Way, and you can barely see it. And so an illustration needs to have really strong enhancement and good skills with Photoshop to really bring stuff out and make it look unrealistic. However, Stellarium does a very good job of presenting stuff that's quite a good illustration, I think. So it's unrealistic. It's not, Milky Way is not that bright, but it's a good illustration. So I'm using this to illustrate the, what we call the Milky Way, commonly called the Milky Way, and it's a very bright band across a dark sky, and sadly a lot of urban people will never see it in their lives because so many people live in urban areas and skies are becoming brighter all the time, and now they're becoming polluted by clusters of thousands of satellites. Anyway, the point here was that it's quite possible that a lot of indigenous peoples would say it's easier to describe this as the trail of the spirits, that is, people on their way to the spirit world. Campfires, it's their individual campfires as they make their way from Earth toward the spirit world. There are a lot of other legends, including one about the bird's path of birds at night. However, I think that some natural observers, those small percentage of people, would say, there's individual stars in there. There's individual red stars and white stars, and you can see little clusters of stars, and it's probably a whole system of stars in space. Don't need to explain it with mythology. So it's a questionable thing that an observer may interpret it with mythology, or may be keen-eyed and decide to want to use their natural observations and say, there's a lot of stars there. Let's see, what other example did I put in here? Oh, this one. You may be familiar with Aurora. It's a case where it's probably easier to interpret as the spirits are dancing, because I doubt anybody without... so I have a degree in physics and chemistry, and I can explain that in terms of magnetic fields from the sun getting embedded into the solar wind magnetic field and then coupling just right with the magnetic field of the Earth, causing high energy particles funnel into the atmosphere in polar regions, cause fluorescence in the atmosphere 100 kilometers high, and cause glowing lights. But would I expect anybody with indigenous natural observations to explain that? No. So I think a lot of some phenomena cannot be explained quite so simply. So I just wanted to give you an illustration that some things are easily explainable, some are not. So we're supposed to be talking about eclipses, okay? So I wanted to mention one feature is the ecliptic, and it's the path across the sky followed by planets, sun, and the moon. And is it possible for somebody with indigenous observations to figure that out? I think yes, for sure. I put in these these photographs I took of some planetary conjunctions, and you may or may not see this one down here. It was a few years ago. Planets Jupiter and Saturn were very close for one day, and some other conjunctions occur from time to time when planets are very close together. And time is up. But the point here was that people would see the planets moving along the ecliptic and say, they're right in line. They follow this line across the sky. And so I put in another illustration here, again from Stellarium. It marks it off with a nice line across the sky, which you don't see when you don't see that line in the sky. However, people could follow planets and say, they're marking off the same line across the sky all the time. And so we call it the ecliptic. It wasn't necessarily called anything, but just for your information, this was Stellarium picture, planetarium software, picture of tonight, or maybe it was last night or a couple nights ago when I did this. Main point here is Jupiter is marked off right here, and Jupiter is following this line across the sky. So I'll come back to this, but I wanted to get on to eclipses and say, do we need mathematical interpretations of orbits and celestial mechanics to understand eclipses? So I don't think so, because all of these eclipses that I photographed of the moon, I'm starting off with lunar eclipses as an introductory to solar eclipses. Introduction, people see the shadow of the Earth crossing the moon, and they can figure out by drawing if they want to draw little sketches in the dirt on the ground or whatever way, they can figure out that the Earth's shadow is crossing the moon during full moon. And so they know when full moon occurs, and they see this happen, lunar eclipses happen every few years generally from any particular location. Maybe not a total lunar eclipse, but from any particular location every few years you can see at least a partial eclipse where at least part of the moon gets covered up by the Earth's shadow. And people can figure that out. To me, it's pretty obvious. It may not be obvious to everyone, but you don't need an app to figure that out. Saw some diagrams earlier that explain that pretty well, and that's fine. So I think, do we need diagrams like this that explain that the moon's orbit is inclined slightly to the solar orbit, or in other words, the Earth's orbit around the sun, the ecliptic? Do we need those interpretations that there are some inclinations and nodes where they occasionally cross? I don't think so. We can explain eclipses just by natural observations. So let me go back to the ecliptic again, just to point out briefly that moon is full, I guess it's tomorrow night, not tonight, but pretty close to full up in here. But the main point here in this illustration is that the moon is a little bit north of the ecliptic. And people can see that occasionally the moon is a little bit north. They don't need to know what 5 degrees is. They just need to say, it's a little bit north of the ecliptic, but they recognize that line where the planets follow. Sometimes it's a little bit south of the ecliptic. So they can figure out the moon oscillates or orbits, or its orbit is inclined a little bit to the ecliptic. They don't need to understand orbital inclination. They just need to know that the moon is sometimes north and sometimes south, and when it crosses the ecliptic, when the timing is just right, there'll be an eclipse. So that's, to me, it's explainable by natural observations. Anyway, that was lunar observations. So you may have seen a diagram like this already, and it simply projects a shadow of the Earth onto the moon. So we don't need to know too many details. I don't think you need to understand that diagram, but that diagram could have been sketched out by somebody with a stick on the ground to explain these things. And so I think lunar eclipses are a good introductory topic to get on to solar eclipses, which are a little bit more complicated. So the point here is I gave you another diagram to illustrate that the shadow of the moon causes a shadow on the Earth, but the main point here is that even if it's cloudy, you can look at the sun some days and see a partial solar eclipse. So you don't need to get blinded. A natural observer doesn't need to have a very clear sky to see a partial eclipse happening. Sometimes the sun is rising above the trees. Most days you'd probably agree are cloudy, and whether they want to or not, some people could figure out that yes, there's a shadow of something crossing the sun without looking at it directly, without getting blinded, which I recommend you don't do. Don't do this, but I think some days it's cloudy enough that you'd see this sort of thing happening. There was an annular solar eclipse last October, and where I live was mostly cloudy, but I did see it through some clouds. with the solar telescope. But the point here is that so a solar eclipse occurs at new moon, and I think people, indigenous peoples, are pretty good at knowing the exact phase of the moon because they hunted, they fished by day and by night, and they lived and knew exactly when moon was rising and setting and its phase, and they knew when it was a day before new moon, and they knew when it would be a day after new moon, even if it was cloudy on the exact new moon date. But new moon didn't take them by surprise, and so they saw that this shadow of the moon, or of something was moving across the sun during new moon, and it becomes fairly obvious that it's the shadow of the moon getting in the way of the sun. So I think it's fairly obvious, these details are fairly obvious to a natural observer, again, without needing orbital mechanics and mathematics to figure out that an eclipse is going to occur. So you've heard some of our previous presenters point out that many indigenous societies knew and could predict eclipses. Well, some didn't. You can find a lot of cases of people being terrified about eclipses and thinking that a dragon or demon or some beast or some animal was eating the sun. And that's fine. You can believe that because I mentioned the public outreach that I did, and where I realized that some people don't worry about it too much, and they look through my telescope at the moon or Saturn and think, wow, cool, nice, and I walk away from it. But other people are really, really curious about these details. And so I think if you want to believe that a beast is eating up the sun during a solar eclipse, yes, you're free to get terrified and run away or go inside and don't look at it. That's free. That's fine. You're welcome to do that. And a lot of people did. So I have no problem believing that a lot of societies or indigenous peoples did that. However, I think at least a few of them would say, hey, neat, there's a solar eclipse happening. And they predicted it. They knew it would happen by timing the cycles, knowing that the moon occasionally gets in, goes north and south from the ecliptic. And occasionally when timing is just right, during the new moon, it will cross in front of it and cause an eclipse. So I think it was sort of obvious to a lot of people. That's my interpretation as just as a natural observer. So I would say that's mostly what I wanted to tell you about eclipses. I wanted to point out one other detail, actually two little details, but nobody's mentioned this yet, so I'll say that if you have clear skies here, and I think everybody in the room is probably willing to observe the total phase of the eclipse rather than hide inside and watch it on television or stay inside during the eclipse. So I suspect most people or everybody here is going to do that. Is going to be glad to and excited to go and look at the eclipse. So I thought I should point out, as a natural observer, some things I want you to look for. I want you to refrain from getting distracted by electronic gadgets, people trying to photograph it. That's a good way to miss a lot of the eclipse. And a lot of people, I've seen 4 total eclipses, and this is a picture of the one in Wyoming back in 2017, but I've seen a lot of people with a lot of complex gadgetry avoid looking at the sun, at the total phase of the sun, because they're busy with their gadgets trying to take photographs. So I really want you to look at it, and if you're there to witness a solar eclipse, not hide inside or watch it on TV. I want you to watch for some things and watch for the crisp shadows on the ground as the crescent solar disk gets thin. That's about 10 minutes before totality. Watch the shadows on the ground and look around and see how things are getting really crisp shadows that are really unusual. Even in April, there'll be some insect and bird activity, I suspect, so you'll notice the air temperature decreasing during the mid-afternoon as we get a good, say, 15, 20 minutes before totality begins and after it ends. And you'll probably notice decreasing bird activity. Just before totality, look around the sky and see the moon's shadow approaching. It's a really neat sight to see if you have a really clear sky. So we saw one illustration of a painting of the sky, even if it were cloudy or partly cloudy, some interesting colors. But if you have a clear sky, look all around and witness the twilight colors all around. It's a really neat sight. It's an amazing sight to see. A very rare thing to see is shadow bands on the ground, but if you think of it, bring a white sheet of paper or a white cloth, put it on the ground, and maybe 30 seconds before and after totality, you may see shimmering waves moving on the ground. It's a pretty rare thing to see. It's not really spectacular, it's a really subtle thing to see, but it's a rare thing to see, and if you think of it, look for it. You'll see some planets nearby in the sky. You'll see the sky get dark. You'll see Jupiter nearby, and you'll see Venus nearby. I put a comet. People, if you're into astronomy, you may or may not have heard of comet Pons Brook, but it's an unknown comet. Unpredictable in the sense that it'll be nearby in April. It's getting brighter. Some predictions are that it could possibly become a naked eye comet, but if so, it'll be between the total eclipse sun and the planet Jupiter, and you may see it. So my point here is I really want you to look around, look at the sky. Don't get bogged down by photography and miss it. So look to Jupiter over to the left of the sun, and look between Jupiter and the sun. You may see this comet if it were bright enough. Solar corona is really the most spectacular thing, and I wouldn't say that my photograph here is the best one ever. I wouldn't say that. I would say that no photograph I've ever seen does it justice to what you actually see. So you saw Randall show a very good sketch. The sketch did a really good job of trying to depict the tenuous tendrils of that corona. It's visible for a few minutes during totality, but it's really it's a really beautiful, shimmering, light blue shimmering bands of corona against a dark blue sky. It's really spectacular to see, so I want you to really enjoy that if you see it. And as I said, don't get distracted by electronic gadgets. So I think I have one more slide to finish off with, and I think you might have heard as a meteorologist, and so I have some interest in weather, so I think you want to really be optimistic and be really excited and really hope for clear skies, because here's a picture from April 8th last year, and you see some clear skies. Ignore all the forecasted. It's the cloudiest area, and it's the clearest sky down here in Texas. This is what happened a year ago, so I want you to be really excited about, optimistic about clear skies here. So that's my point. So I'll say that. I'll end there. It is my contact information, but I'll end there and say thank you very much.